Hello everyone, my name is Eirik. Welcome back to Florence and back into my studio. Today we're going to continue our series on dynamic figure fusion, a technique of sculpture that lends itself to creating works like what Michelangelo was making a lot of the time, though we're certainly not going to reach nearly as high as he did with what we're doing here. It's the pursuit that matters, of course, so let's get into it. Where do we find ourselves after the last episode? We find ourselves, in my opinion, at the end of the block-in stage. There is of course a lot that goes into blocking in a figure. In general, I tend to separate the process into a few major blocks. Block-in being one of course, followed then by modeling and finally finishing. The block-in includes the box and the egg, which we've covered extensively in the first episode. The block-in also includes understanding and setting up the basic proportions of the limbs and the head and the body at large, and it also includes organizing the internal information so it fits the basic proportions and is placed more or less in the right place. That's not to say that the block-in needs to be generic. Far from it, rather. Frankly, in my opinion, it needs to be a lot more specific than what most people tend to think and tend to do. Being specific here, as far as it's possible of course, lessens the burden later in more complex stages and brings the sculpture visually much closer to our reference at an early stage. Stay simplified for too long and the end result often ends up simplified as well. But of course, get too complex too soon and you run the risk of making a mess of things. The block-in stage also includes contours, of course, and the contours of the body are now going to become something that I carefully respect. Consider it like the outline of a figure in a coloring book in some way. If you want whatever you're drawing in your coloring book to look good, you should stay within the lines. And it's similar right here. The contours are therefore going to be respected and stay where they are for now. If I notice a change that needs to be made, something that has to be adjusted, I will make the necessary adjustment. But only when a conscious effort has been brought forward will such a thing take place. As you can see, the sculpture is at the beginning of this video not bereft of shape design exactly. That's where the specificity to our reference in the block-in stage comes into play. For this technique to work properly, we can't get to what we're planning to do today without a decent understanding of the shapes that make up our sculpture. There are a series of shapes that make up the surface of any figure. Here is a rough breakdown so you can see what I'm thinking when working in one smaller area at least. A problem occurs when the block-in is not allowed to mature over enough time. I'm not talking about letting it sit there while you have a coffee. I'm talking about how long you work while your sculpture looks more like what it looks like at the beginning of this video versus what it will look like towards the end of this video. If the breakdown of shapes is not complex enough, and if too many shapes are glossed over, this technique that we're trying to apply here falls apart a little bit. So how long should you work on the breakdown of shapes before progressing the work into the modeling stage? Well, there is no good answer here that applies every time you sculpt. You have to work hard on the block-in until you feel that it simply can't be improved anymore. It needs to be a conscious effort to play with a sculpture that's still very flexible and not fall for the temptation of unifying and bringing the sculpture towards finish. There are certain questions we need to ask ourselves while our work is here versus what we will ask ourselves later, of course. I'm never asking myself questions about transitions, for example. That comes much later. I'm barely asking myself questions about volume. I'm giving my sculpture basic volume to make it appear more like our model, more real, if you will. But I never work with the idea in mind that I'm going to solve volume. Not yet. I'm working with the idea in mind that I'm going to solve issues of drawing. These are simple questions, drawing questions. Questions about up and down, left and right. Yet they are the hardest questions to answer by far, I think. Before talking about what we'll be doing today, even though you can see me doing it right here, we should cover some basic principles that's been applied to the sculpture that leads us to where we are today. We often dub this way of sculpting form isolation, because it simply refers to what we're doing. We're isolating forms from each other, of course. But there's a little bit more to how we do that than perhaps meets the eye. You should leave more space and less clay between every form on the figure. The question students ask very often is something like, are you intentionally misrepresenting your subject then when doing this? And the answer, of course, is yes. I'm not trying to represent everything about my reference right away, just some things. We also need to get awkwardly specific and mechanical with our shape design, knowing that we will get it to a more naturalistic state later while modeling. This means looking for very specific shapes and often using straight lines to design the shapes. Look at the amount of lines that can be used here to describe this form. The more generic version with a soft line communicates the overall size and position relatively well, but the one with straight lines and specific angles communicates the shape design much better. Let me say a few more things about depths between forms before we move on to talking about what's going on screen here. When using the word depth, I'm not simply talking about depth at the borders of each form. Each form needs to sit with a slight depth difference from the others around it. Forms situated at the same depth will often lead to flat results or sharp transitions, almost no matter what you do. You need to respect those contours to maintain good and accurate overall proportions. Behind those contours, you need to look for a bit more depth. Here at the oblique, for example, I will often sink the oblique a few millimeters deeper in comparison to the abdomen than it needs to be, than it's supposed to be, in order to achieve more depth and a more pleasant undulating surface later on when I do modeling. This lets the modeling of transitions take place, and it almost becomes easy to do. Forms will start to transition into each other with a very little effort, and getting those soft, natural transitions that everybody craves becomes not only possible but much more achievable and almost easy. Information, used frequently when I talk about sculpture, like internal information for example, is just a word we use to describe the stuff that we have in our clay or on our clay. So when I say consolidating information, it means that we're not going to be adding a lot of information today. We're going to consolidate what we have. For now, we'll be working in and around the front of the torso, the core of the figure, and the main view of this figure, and we will be trying to consolidate information so that each form stands out as its own form with no questions about it. Clay application is going to matter a lot here, and if you're too messy about it, you're going to have a hard time reading what it is that you've done. Reading what you've done simply means that you can step back and look back and forth between your sculpture and reference and make sense of what you've done in the context of the reference. Consolidating the information currently present in the block-in is a preparatory step, moving us towards the modeling stage of the process. It's sort of like an intermediary step, if you will. I really don't like jumping from block-in to modeling without this step, because the block-in is not as clear as I'd like it to be. What I've done in the block-in, I want to confirm it for myself so that I can feel confident in moving forwards with the sculpture. The sculpture should look good at this point. And if it doesn't, then who knows what will happen once you start modeling. It might turn out to be really not good, after all. This is what we're trying to avoid by giving ourselves a greater level of clarity in terms of what we've done so far. Once a form has its clay notes consolidated, it might turn from this into this. As you can see, the clay is now more unified, and there will be a greater level of readability from a distance. There are 4 things to consider when it comes to the modeling stage. Those things are shape, plane, volume, and transition. But while these are most carefully considered during the modeling stage, some of these are certainly already being considered. Without some evidence of some of these, the figure doesn't exist almost. Shape has been considered almost from the beginning. Once the figure has box and egg and some contours, I start considering shape. The notes on those shapes say something about the plane changes within the form as well. So as the blocking progresses, I do roughly consider plane as well and make sure to let it be included in the blocking. Volume has been considered too, as it's something that is inherently linked to plane, in my opinion. Plane changes within one form occurs because of the volume, of course. But volume adds roundness, and plane changes exists at the apex of each rounded form. So you could have plane without volume, but when you do sculpt like that, without volume, simply with planes, the figure tends to look a little mechanical for my liking. It can be good to think of the modeling stage as the part of the process where everything you've already found is finalized and the transitions are added. At least that's how I tend to treat it these days if I can. I find everything I need, except the transitions, in the block-in part of the process. Most of the work is already done in the block-in, when there is more room and more flexibility to explore and find my sculpture. Versus doing a lot of the work later in the process during the modeling stage, where there is less room to move and the figure really doesn't take so well to the changes that we'd like to make. Front-load your efforts in a strategic manner, and you'll find that your work will happen in a more linear fashion, which is a more peaceful way to sculpt for sure. How do we know that it's time to consolidate information? It's a hard question to answer because there are no formal criteria that we can really look at here. I think it's time to move forwards into the next stage of a process when where you're currently at in that process simply can't be improved anymore. So doing what I'm doing here, consolidating information, should only occur once you're confident in your blocking, I think. If you're a beginner, you won't know what that means or how to properly judge that, of course. When trying to explain things like this to students, I like to return to a Miyamoto Musashi quote, which captures what I'm trying to say better than I could ever say it. And it goes something like this. It's by no means possible for me to write down the science as precisely as I understand it in my heart. There's a lot we can teach our students, but some things the students must simply go through on their own to understand.